Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Third time's a charm. Good to see everybody, and thank you for attending today's book launch for Daniel Macallair's recent release, which documents the history of juvenile corrections here in California and also here nationally. I'm Matt Cervantes, Senior Program Officer at Sierra Health Foundation. I'm also the staff lead for our Positive Youth Justice Initiative. So this feels like I'm at home when it comes to the content. Before we get started, would like to recognize a few folks who are making time to attend today's launch, and would just like to recognize Carol D'Elia, the Executive Director of the Little Hoover Commission. Carol, where are you at? We also have Chief Daniel Hahn. He's the Chief of Police in Roseville. Where's Chief? We are joined today by Rahim Hosseini. I'm sorry, I probably said, I apologize. Staff writer for the Sacramento News and Review. Of course, our speakers are here. Nancy Lee, a member of our board of directors here at Sierra Health Foundation. Also going to say Carol Peterson, who is part of an advocacy group. She's been a member of the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Commission in Santa Clara County, also the wife of our board member, Bob Peterson, and she's right there. We have Michael Newman, who's the director of the Bureau of Children's Justice from the Department of Justice. So, Michael, thank you for being here. So with that, would like to kick us off. Just a brief note, we are broadcasting today's book launch to our offices in Merced, California. We have a group of 15 people there watching, and we'll see the talk with Chet and Dan, as well as the panel that will come later. So just know that this is being broadcast. It's also being recorded. So just, if that is of concern of anybody, I just wanted to notify you of that. A couple of things also to note. Everybody will receive a copy of the book today. So after the event, we'll be distributing the books outside. Dan has graciously agreed to provide an autographed copy for you if you'd like to talk to Dan. So please stick around. We will also have a bit of a celebratory reception afterwards. So if you'd like to stay, network, have some refreshments, you are all invited, and we welcome that participation. Also, as you hear the content today, would really encourage you to think about some of the questions that you might want to ask, not only Dan, but our panelists who will be joining later. We will have an opportunity to engage not only you, but our audience in Merced, where we'll be taking questions. So this will be interactive towards the end of the agenda. So with that, as you know, for those who have been at Sierra Health Foundation and participated in these events, when we talk about young people, we engage young people in that process. And we have an incredible young person among many incredible young people from Stockton today. Takara Johnson is a student activist at UC Davis, freshman, really taking on the world there. We've had Takara come and present to us in the past, and it's a real treat when she brings her work to Sierra Health Foundation. So Takara, please open us up.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Oh, yes, y'all smiling. This is great. Okay. 6 months before my 18th birthday, my mother sat me down and said that we had to have a real conversation. She told me that my worldview and my youth would no longer share direct correlation, that I would no longer be protected by my youth and my worldview. He was only 17. His crime committed months before his adulthood, grand theft auto gone wrong in the 3rd degree, grand theft auto collision through a telephone pole and a tree, hospitalized. and set to sit until his clock struck 18. On April 11th, 2011, they showed up to arrest him. His face, swollen from reconstruction, and his consciousness laid next to his bedpan. His worldview and his youth no longer shared direct correlation, but his mother wasn't there to warn him. She was only 12, mistaken for an adult walking home by herself. Stop and frisk for jaywalking across the street. Misunfortunate encounters with the police. We have learned to police our children with juvenile forces without paying proper attention to the lack of resources. Did you know that 25% of fostered youth will end up incarcerated? So we build more prisons instead of questioning the system and funds allocated. We react against those labeled as criminals, throwing children into the sea of forgetfulness and failing to acknowledge them as individuals, and penalties like sympathy when dealing with juveniles. If I say how I really feel, then I may end up in detention. And I'm not talking about the one after school or an in-school suspension. I'm talking about the detention center, where mentally disabled youth and minorities are being herded in like sheep by wolves in shepherd's clothing. Since when do we go somewhere to get educated and end up getting arrested? The school to prison pipeline don't even sound right. We are darned if we do, darned if we don't. Principals and faculty serve as the new POs. It's a flawed system. Since when do schools and prisons start blending? What has come to be of this thing that we call justice? Juvenile policies haven't changed, they've simply adjusted. Don't trust it. Real reform empowers people and denies isolation. I said real reform empowers people and denies isolation. Real reform is liberation. Thank you.
The state of California is lucky to have Takara. She is not only a student activist at UC Davis, she's a poet mentor through the Sacramento Area Youth Speaks. And we've had a long-time partnership with Sacramento Area Youth Speaks, so thank you, Takara, for your piece. Right now, I would like to kick us off and introduce our first session, which will be moderated by our President and CEO, Chet Hewitt. As anybody who knows Chet, he's committed to young people and families and communities. He is deeply connected to this work around juvenile justice reform. He's the former employee of the Center on Juvenile and Criminal Justice, worked closely with Dan in developing innovative juvenile justice programs in San Francisco and across the country, as I've learned. So, I would like to introduce Chet to come up and take a seat, and I will ask Dan, with proper introduction here, to come up. So Dan is the founder and executive director of the Center on Juvenile and Criminal Justice. His bio is in your packet, and I'm not going to read from it because Dan has a long-time partnership with the Sierra Health Foundation. I mentioned the Positive Youth Justice Initiative. He and his team helped do and conduct research, which helped us develop this initiative. That took place in 2010, and we've been working together ever since. He is a renowned expert in juvenile corrections and juvenile justice. He is well known across this country and even internationally. And he is an incredible leader and has a wonderful team as part of his organization. We're thankful for him agreeing to allow us to launch his book into the field. So with that, I turn it over to Chet and Dan.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you, Matt.
You know, Matt introduced me and said that I worked at the Center on Juvenile and Criminal Justice. We were much younger men than
we were.
Dan.
I had a full head of hair at that time.
And I learned a tremendous amount. But I will say that as I've read the book, and you can see how mine is pretty marked up, I actually learned a lot more. You know, we all think we know a lot about juvenile justice, its evolution, but it just reminded me how much more there is to learn. So I guess my first question for you is, you know, why did you write the book? You know, what were you hoping to catalyze by undertaking, you know, this particular effort?
Well, thank you, Chet, and thank everybody. I'm kind of overwhelmed and humbled by this turnout, and I very much appreciate it. So the question is, why did I write this book? This is my 30th year in the field. In fact, it's my I take that back. It's my 30th year with my present organization. I actually started in the youth correction system in Massachusetts back in the 80s. So I go back. I have a little bit of history. Most of my time I have spent on issues of juvenile justice reform. And it's really been much of the focus of my career. And I go back now to the late 80s. And I've been involved in the issue for so long, and I've been in on the meetings, done the studies, done the analysis, had the debates. And one of the things that kept coming up, and one of a consistent theme, when people think about juvenile justice, we always think about the new institution. And it's always been, at least in my experience, kind of the starting point. Mm-hmm. That in order to have an improved juvenile justice system or improve the functioning of the juvenile justice system, we have to improve on all those old institutions that in many cases have failed us very miserably over the years. And so I wanted to look back and see, well, did we just think about this during our time in the last 20 years? Or did they have these debates back 30 years ago, 50 years ago, 70 years ago, or back to the 19th century? And guess what? We've been having the same discussion and debates going back to the 19th century, and in some cases early in the 19th century, the same arguments, and very often the same so-called solutions, or what seemed to be solutions at the time. And the solution was build a better institution. And then in about very short period of time, there's this kind of cycle, about a 30-year period, suddenly the inadequacies of that solution that previous solution comes to light. There's more discussion, there's debate, people get together, and they start coming up with the new idea. And the new idea was always, well, that institution didn't work very well. It wasn't big enough, didn't have enough rehabilitation in it. We need to build a better one. And then they build a better one. Or so they thought. And then pretty soon, within a very short time, all of those old problems that this new institution was supposed to address, suddenly it starts to manifest itself again. All the same problems, they come back. And one of the fascinating things about writing this and doing the research for it, the research I found fascinating because I'm going through old archives and documents and and reading what people thought. And people were pretty smart 100 years ago. The debates, what was shocking to me is when I was going through these archives and these old documents, is that the debates really hadn't changed very much. And it always revolved around the institution. And, as I write in the book, I think one of the reasons is once the institution was established, and the juvenile justice system, juvenile institutions stem from the penitentiary movement of the late 1800s, or the late 18th century, and in the early 19th century, we decided to turn that model into, use that model with kids. And once they were established, they became the structure, they became the system. And so any debate that came after that focused on how to improve this existing system. And it became almost locked in, decade after decade. And so, anyways, that's what prompted me to write the book. I'm sorry.
Can you tell he's passionate about it?
Give me the
opening. Sense of that? Well, let's take folks through a little bit of the history in order to kind of encourage them to read the book, because there's a lot of information in the book, and some of it is pretty painful stuff. It's really worth reading because there are really important lessons in it. So the idea of juvenile justice, kids, being different than adults, really kind of getting traction around this notion of industrial schools.
Right.
And so why don't you say a little bit about the industrial schools, the kind of idea behind it, and what gave rise to, as you described, kind of the first cohort of institutions that were really designed to reform young people and put them on a better path.
Right. Well, we've gone through kind of different eras of institutionalization, and really the book is about institutionalization, and it's focused on California. But what was interesting about California is the California followed the national trends. So whatever we did here, somebody else had done someplace else. So if you go back on the origins of the juvenile justice system in the United States, you probably go back to the starting point is 1825, which is the opening of the New York House of Refuge, and then that became the first movement in the juvenile justice field. And for the next 25 years, they built about between 20 and 25 of them in the various states, mostly along the eastern seaboard. And that became the first institutional model. And it was primarily focused, and by the way, it's all of these institutions, this will not come as a surprise to anyone. These were focused on the children of the poor. It's always been the case, regardless of who they were, where they came from. And early on, it was focused on immigrant children and living in urban areas, and that was the House of Refuge movement. Well, it turned out that that didn't work out so well. That quickly they achieved a reputation for abuse and the staff. It's the same dynamic. The struggle for control by staff. And one thing they taught us is that human beings do not take well to confinement. We don't take well to involuntary confinement. And when we are placed in situations of involuntary confinement, we tend to resent it. And whether you're a 5-year-old, a 10-year-old, 15-year-old, or a 20-year-old or older, it's pretty much the same consistent pattern. So you'd throw the kids into these institutions. They used to put them in big open dormitories, and you'd have a few staff. There's no textbook they're working from. And so it becomes a struggle for control, and the staff were always trying to keep, the most important thing was trying to keep the kids under control. And I've been a teacher, I know how difficult that can be. But as the institutions filled up, the dynamic became one of the staff always fighting for control, the kids who were there involuntarily rebelling against that control, and it just would escalate. You do this or else, and a kid doesn't do it, and oh yeah, I'll show you, and it just kind of, and it escalates, ultimately with the same outcome. These became places of brutality, harsh treatment, and ultimately become places of brutality, where staff are always kind of increasing the level of brutality in order to maintain control. And this was a consistent pattern going back to the day that New York House of Refuge opened on January 1st, 1825. And it continued into the industrial school, which becomes the second era in institutionalization in the United States. The House of Refuge movement kind of died out in 1850. They stopped calling institutions that. They just changed the names. They don't really change the design, but we changed the names. And houses of refuge gave way to reform schools, training schools, industrial schools, and they're synonymous terms. But the desire was to place a greater emphasis on education, because at that time, the public education movement was getting underway. In 1857, we have the first compulsory education law. And so the institutions wanted to be identified as places of education and places of reformation. That's how they were sold. That's how they were sold to the public. But the reality is they were very much prisons. And so the industrial school came to California. Originally, it was to be a house of refuge. And in 1852, the San Francisco Board of Supervisors passed an ordinance setting aside land for the building of a house of refuge. They wanted to be like everybody else on the East Coast, and they wanted to bring that model because that was the height of the gold rush. And in the gold rush era in San Francisco, the population is exploding, and as the gold started to die out, you had lots of destitute, desperate children, abandoned children, wandering the streets of San Francisco. And they didn't like them hanging out down on the waterfront next to the brothels and the saloons and the gambling houses. And so they're going to build a house of refuge to save them. And then, and it's interesting, when they got around to building it in 1858, 1859, they changed the name for the industrial school, which really marks a turning point in the history of juvenile corrections or juvenile justice in America, because that was the kind of the split. We moved away from the House of Refuge movement and we entered the reform school movement.
Yeah. And I want to stop there because one of the things in the book that I think is relevant, because we're having this debate today around mass incarceration, was the description of who they were designed to serve.
Yeah.
Now, you talked about this a little bit. You know, they were the children of immigrant communities.
Yeah.
And they talked about in New York how it was folks who were arriving from Europe, largely Irish.
Yeah, yeah.
Kind of a outcast society, living on the margins of, you know, American society. And the idea that this type of institutionalization was okay for that particular population. Now, what would you say, before we get into the transition between the industrial schools and reform schools and this notion of it being about reform primarily in education and others, you know, as you kind of connect the history to what's happening today, you know, what would you offer up by way of insight about how certain populations are more amenable to or more suggestive of systems that use this kind of repressive approach in order to apparently attempt to produce a good outcome? The outcome here sought after was kids who are better prepared, better able to live productive lives, but the institutions were failing at their ability to do that in any number of ways.
Yeah. Well, there was a lot of propaganda. I mean, there was a lot of, early on, there was actually, with the early institutions, there was actually this kind of desire among many to create some type of social intervention, social policy that would deal with the growing problem of child poverty and kids wandering the streets of New York. I mean, that's really where it all began. And it would tug at your heartstrings. If you were walking through the streets of New York in 1830, thousands of children out wandering the streets barefoot and dressed in rags. I mean, it had a powerful impact on you. And but at the same time, going to your question, Chet, there was very much a dichotomy in terms of the approach or how the kids were viewed. One degree it was with sympathy, but the other degree it was an inferior class, that they were kind of the less deserving. And I think it somehow rings true today. You had a notion that even though these institutions were set up with the idea that we were going to educate them, we're going to give them religious instruction to find the path to virtue, and prepare them for the world of work, elementary education, all that. The emphasis was really, it was the belief that these kids were not really going to aspire to much. That this was really the future laboring class. And the most important thing was keeping them, kind of understand that we're keeping them under control. And that was early on. And it just, if you read there was always issuing these annual reports, and these superintendents were writing these reports, and it always just kind of flows from it. It's this class of children. And I've toured facilities here, and I've had staff over the years tell me, well, these kids are different. You always hear that. And they were doing it back then. I think the institutions did a good job in terms of selling themselves as this notion that they were providing an important function and solution to a very profound social problem. And I know that if you went to the institutions, they were very well ordered. They were run around the penitentiary model, and you often enforced rules through the use of the lash. And Charles Dickens and Lexis de Tocqueville, they toured the New York House of Refuge, and they thought it was all right, because you took the tour. When you take these tours, and I've been on tours in state facilities here, they get kind of the nice impression that everything is good, it's all orderly, and everything's clean, and sometimes, that was true, and that was true back then. But I think but it was always one thing that always clearly dominated the thinking and permeated the writing was that this was a different class of kids. These weren't our kids, but we were doing the right thing for them.
And I think that was one of the things that really struck me in the book, because you hear that theme repeatedly about this class of kids, and it actually migrated through different populations.
That's right.
It was always the folks who were on what was then considered the margins of society, going forward. So, now we're in this kind of reform period where reform schools replace the failed ideas that gave rise to the refuge in the industrial schools in California, first industrial school in San Francisco. Reform schools become the next big fix.
Yep.
You know, you have Whittier and Preston kind of show up, and out of the challenges and the horrors that took place in the industrial schools, you now have the next organization, next institution that's going to fix this. So maybe if you could set the context for the reform school movement and how they were supposed to be different than what was being done in the industrial school.
Yeah, that's a good question. And so actually, we entered the next phase here in California. It was the reform school movement, which we did in the 1890s. Well, the reason we entered that phase is because the industrial school was a dismal failure. It was opened, it was the first correctional institution west of the Mississippi. It opened in 1859. And for the next 30 years, it was a disaster. One scandal after another. I've detailed some of it in the books. They had this technique of where they keep the kids under control, bucking and gagging, where you put a stick in the kid's mouth and then you tie him. You basically hog tie him and lay him on the floor for a couple of days, and that would render him submissive. And then, or you throw them in a dark cell. And they used to have these. You have these grand jury investigations, and you find kids in dark cells on bread and water, and that was kind of the way. So that was kind of the way things were kept under control. Public got a little outraged at times when stories leaked out and it ended up in the press. And by 1890, they were done with the industrial school. Plus, it had come as a reputation. In fact, in the banner headline that appeared in the San Francisco Call when the industrial school was closed in 1891 was wiped out at last, long denounced as a nursery of crime by the judiciary. That was the epitaph for the San Francisco Industrial School, our first institution, our first congregate institution. So then what happens? So this was all recognized in the 1880s, and so what happens now is there's a big debate up here in Sacramento about where do we go from here? This institution was a disaster, and so what do we do? And immediately they start planning to build the next round of institutions, and but they did a interesting. They toured the governor at the time, sent out a delegation to tour other facilities around the country, and they sent out letters to governors and administrators, and they got interesting responses. At that time, there was a huge debate going on in the juvenile justice, what was not quite the juvenile justice system, but the emerging juvenile justice system, among institutional leaders about what's the best type of institution. And there was a back and forth, a debate. And there were two models. There was the congregate model, which is essentially the penitentiary model, and the cottage system, the cottage model. And the cottage model was to be the antithesis of the congregate model, because the congregate model the congregate institution is designed for the efficient management of large numbers of people using tight regimentation, tight structure, and harsh discipline. And that's what they all were at the time. So they wanted so there was a new idea about coming up with a cottage system that would be more family-oriented. You'd have these little semi-autonomous living units, about 30 to 40 kids in them, with a married couple who would serve as kind of surrogate parents. And I don't know what they thought they were going to do with 30 kids in a surrogate. I don't know. I had 4 kids in my house, and we fought all the time. But that model was the alternative to the congregate system, because in the congregate system you'd have 100 to 200 kids in big open dormitories. But that was the model. That was going to be the different type of institution. And there was a huge debate and virtually unanimous. It was an almost unanimous opinion from across the country. Experts from around the country, administrators told California that you should go with the cottage system. It's a better system. Congregate model, too many problems, too much violence, too hard to control. Completely ignored. They got the reports in, and the next thing you know, the legislature, I couldn't find regular records of the debate, but the legislature passed legislation for calling for 2 reform schools, congregate design. And I know why. They're more economically efficient. You can hold more kids if your institution, if you keep getting commitments, you just cram them in, you crowd it. And so it's more economically efficient, and that's why it won. So the cottage system was the big debate in the 1880s, but the legislature ignored it. We established the Whittier State School in 1891, which was the second, actually the third state, well, first state-run reform school, and then 3 years later, Preston was opened in 1894, and that brought us into the reform school era. Now, what was different from the House of Refuge era? Mostly the name, what we called them. But the reform schools did reflect a greater emphasis on education. In the old days, in the early 19th century, it was on work, preparing kids to enter the workforce. So when they got up in the morning at 5:30, you'd march them off to school. They'd go to school for an hour, and then they'd march them off to some work detail for the rest of the day, and then come back around 5. They'd eat in between, and then they'd go off to their classroom for an hour, another hour, and then they go to bed. They'd have real Bible readings. That was a big thing, and then go to bed. The reform school was different because they changed the day around. When they got up in the morning, they went to work, but they spent most of the day in school because they wanted it to reflect the importance of education, which has now become a national movement at the time. And that was a major difference between the reform school and the houses of refuge. So, but they were congregate institutions. House of Refuge, congregate institutions, reform school, congregate institutions. And then that just takes us into the 20th century.
So you have changes in the milieu. You have changes in the way the day is organized for young people, but you still have, I think, and this shows up in the book, I think even a more detailed description of the kind of violence that command and control environment really gave rise to.
Yeah.
There are still 2 stories that I found really disturbing there, and I want, actually 3 things. I want to talk about them. I know for time's sake I'm going to link these things together more closely. One was the death of Benny Moreno at the Whittier School, I actually believe that actually took place.
Yes.
And I think that his death not only called up the limits around command and control and what it does to kids, but also the type of violence that was perpetrated about young people by folks within the institution itself in a cover-up.
Yeah.
And a subsequent death by Edward LaVea, who was also described in the book as well. But it was also a period in which, you began to talk about, or the system began to talk about and classify young people based on what their future potential was. Eugenics movement, right? Which actually led to folks being forcefully sterilized.
Yeah.
And so now you have this institution that's supposed to be about the development of young people as it moved out of the kind of despicable period represented by industrial schools into this reform school movement where education and human development was supposed to be at the core. And it seems like these things, the behavior of staff, lack of training, and this notion of kind of classification around young people really pull them right back into a system of operating that looked very much like the industrial school. I'll end by saying that as a colleague of mine who talked to me about pattern behavior institutions that just simply repeat their pattern, change names and titles, kind of structures on the bottoms. And for me, as I read this particular set of chapters in the book, this section of the book, I could see it was clearly at play. A little bit more sophisticated, some new bells and whistles and twists perhaps, but at its core, repressive command and control environments that really isn't good for the healthy development of young people. So,
that's a good. One of the most interesting chapters in California juvenile justice history was this eugenics movement that became popular, actually in the 19 teens, and it actually started. And what a lot of people don't know is that, and I need to give a shout out before I even. There's a professor at UC Davis who did a wonderful study on the eugenics movement because this was a very unrecognized part of California juvenile justice history. And in many ways, we led the nation on the eugenics movement. Actually, California did, but particularly in our juvenile justice system. And it had to do with efforts to try to improve the functioning of the institution. Again, improve the functioning of the institution. And it started in 1912 with the election of Hiram Johnson. Now, Hiram Johnson was a governor who was we all know him, maybe you know him or not, but he was a reform governor. He was a reform governor. He gave us the initiative and the recall and the initiative, recall, and referendum. He also gave us Fred Nellis. Fred Nellis he appointed as head of the Whittier State School. And Fred Nellis was a businessman, didn't have any background in juvenile justice, but an energetic leader, and I think relatively well-meaning. And he gets put in charge of the Whittier School, which at this time was of course wrapped in scandal. Numerous newspaper exposés and kids being beaten, and you had a whole, from the day it opened. So Hiram Johnson appoints Fred Nellis to come in and fix it. And Nellis doesn't really know what to do, so he consults with a professor at Stanford University by the name of Lewis Terman. Now, I don't know if any, but Lewis Terman was one of the leaders in the eugenics movement, which is the plan, you improve the human race by eliminating the folks who are carriers of defective genes was the basic approach. And so you can imagine the implications of that. So Nellis consults with Terman, and at this time, I want to be real clear, the eugenics movement was seen as a progressive movement during this period. People were buying into it. Academics, because they're being told that, hey, they're the favored class. You guys we're sitting up here. We're here because of our special talents and abilities. And those people at the bottom of the social economic ladder, well, that's because of who they are and what they came into the world with. And there's not much we can do about it. And so it was a nice justification for the existing social status. They always had a lot of money. Rockefellers and Carnegies poured a lot of money into it. So what happens is Nellis comes in and he's made superintendent of the Whittier State School, and he wants to try to fix it and clean it up. And so he gets the idea, and it's determined, plants it in his head, we'll get rid of the feeble-minded kids. And so we'll start, Terman had developed the Stanford Binet IQ test. And so they send a team down from Stanford University, they set it up, and they start testing kids. And of course, they find out, the bunch of all feeble-minded. They had the huge numbers of kids of Latino background were designated as feeble-minded. African Americans were next on the, and then a small smattering of the white kids. And then what happened is they shipped many of them off to the Sonoma State Hospital in Glen Allen. And these kids were under indeterminate sentences, so they'd get down there, and then they were told that, okay, well, we'll let you go if you decide to have a sterilization operation. But it was the idea is to clear out the kids, the low-performing kids, in favor of the higher-performing kids. Then we'd have this wonderful institution, and we'll finally make the institution work. And that was what and that's really what they wanted to do. They wanted to clear out those they thought were of low-performing. And it wasn't out without some people contested it and said this was wrong, and you're not taking into account, because Terman's belief was that intelligence was this. They were these people who were steeped in this. Nonsense, the IQ test was the ultimate determiner. So one time taking the exam, your intelligence was fixed.
It was hardwired. There's nothing that could ever be done.
It was a deterministic approach, and so they started testing these kids, and so it was the idea is that you would kind of you'd eliminate the underperforming kids, and if you had just had an institution with overperforming kids, we'd have a good institution, no problems, and everything would move along very nicely. And it didn't work that way, of course. It's the same with the same results, but with tragic results for the kids that were shipped to the state mental health institution. Benny Moreno, that you mentioned, Chet, actually followed. Benny Moreno actually ushered in the next era of reform. The reform, the eugenics movement was the reform of the 1920s, and it was and by the end of the 1930s, partly because of cuts in state funding, it started to run its course. But it had make no mistake about it, the eugenics movement had this kind of classist impact that lasted long after its passing.
Well, I ask and I connect those two things because, again, as I think about where we are today, this notion of how we viewed who the system was serving, and what we were willing to tolerate by way of the services or interventions that we use to correct what we perceive to be a social problem.
Yeah.
And for those of us in this room who work a lot around the development of kids, and I don't care if you're in education or anything else, I think this was really, really important. So we are, we have these, 2 deaths of 2 young men.
Yep.
You can read about it in the book, unfortunately, and it pushes us towards the next institutional reform,
Yeah.
which is the Youth Authority.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
introduce us to the
Yeah.
Youth Authority.
So the Youth Authority, what became known as the California Youth Authority was actually the next era of reform. That comes in the 1940s, begins in the 1940s. And it does come about as a result of the tragic suicide or not suicide, I don't believe it was suicide, nor did some of the people doing the investigation, of a death of a young man at the Whittier State School in August of 1939. That was Benny Moreno. And again, yeah, it's the story is in there. And but what happens is it sets about a series of events and creates a political dynamic that starts to call for reform again. You got to have a scandal before you're going to have reform, tragically. Otherwise, things just keep going as they always have. And so what happens is there's a series of investigations. It culminated in one investigation by a judge by the name of Ben Lindsay. And those of you who don't know the history of juvenile justice, Ben Lindsay was like one of the great names in the early days of the juvenile justice system. And he is a judge in Los Angeles County at the time. And he's assigned by Governor Colbert Olson to do an investigation. And they do, and it was one of the most thorough investigations ever done of the institutions, and it was damning. I mean, the physical and sexual abuse that was revealed, and just the horrible treatment that kids were subjected to, and often through just, if not inflicted by the staff who remained indifferent, and unfortunately from top down. Kind of one of the it's the classic issue with institutions. So what happens once again? We're going to enter another era of reform. And in the late 1930s, there were problems that were being recognized in institutions throughout the country. And there was this book written called Youth and the Toils that chronicled the experiences of kids in young offenders in New York institutions. And so there's a body called the American Law Institute at the University of Pennsylvania at the time. They conduct a national, they pull together a panel of national experts, and they formulate this model, what was called the Model Act. It was called the Youth Corrections Authority Act. And California was the first to adopt it. And what the Youth Corrections Authority Act was originally for young people in the adult system, the 18 to 25 age group. And that was what the Youth Authority was originally intended to be, an institution for younger adults in the adult system. They rewrote a couple sentences in the original legislation, and so it became this hybrid, taking adult court commitments and juvenile court commitments, and ultimately became primarily juvenile court commitments. But the difference here, we're not abandoning the institution with the Youth Authority. Once again, we're back to how do we make the congregate institution work? How do we finally make it rehabilitative? Now, this is in the 1940s, and they're experimenting with a lot of new psychological testing. The field of psychology has kind of grown a little bit. And so now what's going to happen is we're going to create the model institution, and we're going to usher in this new era on the wings of science. And science is going to provide the answer. So the new Youth Authority, as it was conceived, and originally it was 1941, it started in 1941, and then Earl Warren came in as governor in 1942. And then he decided that because of the conditions in the three reform schools were so bad that he told the Youth Authority, you're now running these institutions. Well, what they decide is that they're going to, the way they're going to reform the system is they're going to create better systems of diagnosis. They're going to create diagnosis and assessment centers. And they're going to use modern techniques of testing. And once they did that, then they would assign a kid to a specialized institution that supposedly would meet their need. You know, the younger kid, older kid, mentally ill kid, kid who needs special education, kid who doesn't need special education, kid who needs some type of specialized vocational training. So we're going to have all these specialized institutions, and kids would be assigned to these institutions accordingly. And that was the vision. And we will never have another era of reform like this, because Earl Warren was a crusader on this issue. He did have a passion for criminal justice reform, and they poured resources in it. He hired very able administrators to institute this new model, and beginning with Carl Holton, who was the first director of the Youth Authority, who was then followed by Heman G. Stark. And Carl Holton was a former chief probation officer in LA County, and had been a pioneering chief. He had developed the concept of work camps that became the basis for the Civilian Conservation Corps during the Roosevelt administration. And so he was an innovator and a very good, able leader. And he came in and he tried to, first he replaced some of the superintendents of the old institutions, and he started to get resources to build new institutions. And as we get through the 1940s and into the 1950s, the new Youth Authority is now on this, launching this major effort to build new institutions. I mean, it was the largest institution building period in state history, roughly from beginning in the 1950 to 1968. And so we built all these institutions, and it was going to be, again, this was going to be the era of juvenile justice reform. California was going to do what nobody else did. And California, interesting, achieved a national reputation. And what's interesting, and I think this is an important point that I try to bring out in the book, is that California achieved a great reputation. We had great leaders who were able to articulate wonderful vision. And it's that vision that they were able to articulate is what really won California the accolades that it got, again, from around the country and around the world. But unfortunately, and this was admitted by even the leaders who were very much the advocates for this new institutional system, by the early 1960s, they started to recognize that this was not working. This institutional system was not working. And so what happens then is they shift. And California then, in 1964, begins the Community Treatment Project, and then later probation subsidy, which comes out of the youth authorities, the upper echelons of the youth authority, because they realized, first of all, institutional care was not working, and that, and as Heman G. Stark, the second leader of the youth authority, even acknowledged that this is probably not going to work. That's when we start to shift our emphasis towards experimenting with community-based care and probation subsidy and the community treatment program, one of the famous, actually the largest experiment of its time, up until that point, where California actually launched an experimental program where you put, they did a randomly divided groups of kids who were committed to the youth authority, you put the control group into the institutions, the standard method of care, and they took the experimental group and put them out into the community, and then see how they tested, see how they did after a period of time, and it was about a 25% difference in recidivism rates after, I think after 2 years. Mm-hmm. So.
Well, we're getting short on time, and we've said a lot about the book. Like as I said earlier, it's really worth kind of reading through. It's a fascinating book. I said it's not a happy book, but I think for those of us who care about kids, it's really instructive about the going forward. So I'm going to ask you to do two things here, Dan. I want you to give us talk a little bit about, there's another section where you move from youth authority to youth corrections, so say a little bit about that particular shift. But then I really want you to focus on, what's next. What should we be thinking about as we go forward? Great stuff has happened around juvenile justice in California. I think for me, the most important thing I'd point out is that now we're down to about 600 kids, down from 10,000 in the late 90s. And in some ways, we're in that cycle again. We realize the big congregate institutions aren't working, and we're doing something else as we're awaiting what the next big organization, institutional or movement might actually be. So if you could connect, what happens towards the end of this youth authority build out, where, and this is an interesting part of the book, at least I thought so, was that their zest for scientific methodology and data collection actually even more strongly proved how badly they were failing. Because they collected all this data that actually showed that things were not going well. And it was almost in some respects, almost irrefutable at that point because of the work that they had actually done. Yet they continue to kind of move forward and even built, I think in one section of the book talks about what was then a new facility in Chino that was going to house 1,000 kids in the same institution. So despite all the knowledge and science and everything else, people continue down the same path. We're in a period now where we're actually rethinking what happens next. Juvenile justice is getting pushed back to the counties. Well, so if you can connect the corrections piece to where we are now, and what would be the 2 or 3 big lessons for those of us in this room who are really committed to something being different for children next go around that we really have to pay attention to. And then I'm going to prepare for 2 panelists to come up and share as well. So.
I think one of the big things is one of the lessons of history here is that, and it was in the 1950s and the 1960s when the California Youth Authority achieved this reputation as this wonderful model. And they did a lot to market it. Make no mistake about it. It achieved this reputation of these good institutions, well-run, rehabilitative, and it sent this message back to the counties. Now, California, we have a 2-tiered system here. That we've got county government, we got 58 counties, and then we've got the state youth correction system. In this case, it was the California Youth Authority. They never wanted to, the youth authority people, when they were pushing the youth authority model, did not want to alienate local juvenile court judges. So they basically accepted anybody that was committed from local county courts. Well, I got to tell you, folks, a lot of people are under this mistaken belief that you've got a juvenile justice system here in California that is, the laws are made here in Sacramento. But the reality is we have 58 different systems, and every county does things differently. And this is something that they struggled with early on with the youth authority, and it comes up over and over, is that you had some counties that would just ship any kid they could off to the state institutions, and other counties that wouldn't. It didn't, and it created huge disparities. And that has been true since the early days, right down till today. So we've had that. So we've had those county disparities, and as I said, as the youth authority's reputation grew, commitment rates went up because judges would say, hey, we can't handle them here at the county. We'll send them off to the state. They know what they're doing, and they really didn't. But but it made everybody happy, and it's kind of like the school principal. You want to get rid of the problem student. Again, I was in my teaching. I remember those. So this has been the dynamic, and it's been the dynamic right down to today. Now we're in an extraordinary period, and one that there is no parallel to. Since 1996, and California always had a very high incarceration rate, but since 1996, our juvenile incarceration rates at the state level have been plummeting. And we started off in 1996 with 10,000 kids in 11 institutions, and right now we're at about 700 with 3 institutions left. And that's a great success, by the way. The main reason for that, however, is that the kids have stopped committing crimes. It's not necessarily anything we did. There's some little things we did. I don't want to take, but we had 60,000 arrests for violent crimes, juvenile violent arrests, or serious and violent arrests in 1996. We had about 20,000 last year. So we've gone from 60,000 to 20,000. It's a tremendous drop. And we'll leave it to the greater minds of the criminologists to explain that.
No one actually can explain what.
No, nobody can explain. I always tell my students it was video games. I don't mean that. But But, so where we are today, there was the old California Youth Authority is gone. And the reason it's gone is because of a lawsuit brought against it for all the same reasons that the Youth Authority was founded, to fix the problems of the past. Those old institutional models that failed us in the past ushered in the Youth Authority, and we had a 40-year history with the Youth Authority, and it utterly failed. And it was the same issues, the same exact problems. And no matter what we did, it did not change the reality, the daily reality of life within that congregate institution. And I often, sometimes you see in the writings that the 1960s were this heyday of institutional care in California. It was actually one of the most violent periods of institutional care in California. And despite all the rhetoric, despite all the promises, despite all the investments, the reality of daily life in institutions did not change. It did not change from the 1890s right up until pretty much today.
I'm glad you actually said that, because again, as I went back through the book yesterday, the thing that I was left with was that even in this period leading up to where we are now, the challenges that have given rise to the fall of the Youth Authority were the same things that gave rise to the fall of the industrial schools as well. So it's almost like we've been in this pattern of behavior that hasn't changed in any way, despite new technologies and science and sociology and other things. The challenge of the congregate care environment and command and control environments just don't seem to be conducive, given what we've learned in state technology, for the healthy development of young people. And in some ways, you can condense it down to something as simplistic. I know a little over time, but I really want to press you to give those of us who are in this audience, the big three. I mean, what are the things that we have got to insist upon, fight for, demand for our children as we go forward? Because, as I said, as the system is being devolved back to counties, we have an opportunity not to simply rebuild at the county level, but fail at the state level. Right? Which would be, in many respects, I think, a catastrophe and an extraordinarily missed opportunity if we would allow that to actually happen. So, for those of us who'd like some insight, what would those three big things be?
So the first thing would be and I get a lot of pushback on this. I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings, but I would eliminate the state system. I think you push it back to the counties. The counties have sufficient institutional capacity right now. It's a failed model, and as long as it exists, it will continue to be the temptation will always exist to for counties to abdicate responsibility for their problem kids. And the problem with the state system is that there is no connection to the communities where the kids come from. Ultimately, what determines a success is not what happens, how the kid behaves when they're in the institution, it's what happens when they come back to their communities. And if we haven't dealt with that issue, then we've abdicated responsibilities as a society. So if we're gonna create a system for the future, what we need to do is focus on what the kid comes back to. If we spend $258,000, as we do today for a kid in a state institution, invest that same amount of money when we see, maybe not that same amount, but invest in the kids' communities, reinvest in those communities where those kids come from, we'll achieve a lot better results in the long run, I will assume. I mean, heck, you can send a kid to Stanford for that much. So I'm hoping that as we move forward, we do heed the lessons of history and not repeat them. And there is a danger. I mean, I highlight in the book, there's already a proposal to rebuild the Youth Authority out there. And good people, well-meaning people, and I hope I don't hurt anybody's feelings. But the design, they actually laid in their proposal, they actually laid out the design for the rebuild of the facility. And I couldn't help it. I couldn't resist the temptation, but I put it right next to a diagram of the proposed facility for Whittier in 1890. It's the exact same design, including the windy streets and the fountain in the middle. I think it's a warning. I think there's a need for a state role. I think that I do not believe that the counties will reform themselves. There's been some great stuff going on at the county, don't get me wrong. But I think that system-wide, for the counties to fully reform themselves, we got to focus our energy there. And I think that's that should be the effort of the 21st century juvenile justice
I'm
reform.
going to push a little bit. So we have, county is the locus of service for kids, and the state a new role, but it shouldn't be around the kind of custody of kids.
Yeah.
Number two would be, and I heard you talk about, I don't want to create it for you, you talked a lot about this notion of community treatment and what happens in the community, since kids will be served in their community as well.
Yeah, no, that you articulated very well, better than I did.
I listen well sometimes. Worked for Dan for a long time. You have to listen, right? You got to learn what's going on.
Yeah,
What would your third one actually be?
Actually, I think there is a state role, and I think there has to be a monitoring role. And I think that don't try to, you can't have the same agency monitoring the standards in another jurisdiction when you can't meet those standards. So the state role should be one of oversight, monitoring, accountability. And actually, this was proposed in the Little Hoover Commission report in 2007, and Carol's here, I know. And it's a really good plan. I mean, so we've got the plan out there. It's just it's time to implement.
Many of you know I'm a former county welfare director, and I know that the idea of experimentation in 15 counties is an interesting one, and there's some upsides to it, but the differentiation in treatment and experience is something to be concerned about, because you shouldn't get some long sentence in one county for something that, if it's done in another county, and it's an identical offense of some sort, that you have a very different outcome. I mean,
right.
In the work that we do, we all talk about equity a lot, fairness, right? There's something inherently unfair when you think about that. So this idea of a state role for training, oversight, and monitoring, but also to ensure that your zip code or county of offense shouldn't disproportionately affect the experience you have when you went to that system,
right.
I think is important going forward as well.
Yep.
Our next session, we're going to bring up two people, and I'm going to introduce them quickly. First is Samuel Nunez, who is the Executive Director of Fathers and Families of San Joaquin in Stockton. He founded the agency more than 10 years ago and is focused on healing and health to address underlying structures and systemic factors necessary to make general progress towards community well-being. Mr. Nunez, come on up. I've gotten to know Sammy quite well, and I think this part of his bio is right on point. His extensive experience, knowledge, and a profound understanding of what it means to work with young men and fathers. And we also have Ruben Mesta, who is a juvenile justice advocate, and he's a participant in Fathers of Family of San Joaquin Youth Matters program. He was born in Tracy, has been impacted by his experience in California's Youth Authority, has chosen to give back. Now, the youth who are now going through similar experiences. The family members on parole, he first experienced the juvenile justice system through frequent home raids by police, and at a young age was sent to CYA. We had several experiences, and he'll kick us off, and he'll share his story, including the death by suicide of a friend who had faced abuse from staff. And that galvanized him to want to make change in his community today. Ruben?
A little bit about myself, born and raised in Tracy. My family's all from Tracy. We migrated from Southern California. My grandmother and grandfather got married in Tracy, established a family. My grandfather was a veteran in the Second World War. He bought a house. He's pretty much spoiled his kids, where my uncle was a musician, was getting paid good money until he passed away on the music. And my father was spoiled, so he kind of went towards the wrong path of being negative, and he was incarcerated mostly all my life. And so me growing up a part of the system, I just realized that the choices that I made led me to be in that system. The demographics I lived in the projects. One-to-one continuation school after school, 12 o'clock. We had nothing to do besides chill at the park, drink a beer, do the kid thing, And we have a lot of law enforcement in Tracy, California. Not too much after-school programs, but there's a lot of, you're documented, So I got documented as a kid, and was part of the system. But once I got a part of the system, and I thought that we were supposed to be treated that way, like you're not going to become nothing. When you get out, you're going to be a future prison inmate. Or I was like, okay, could I get my GED now, or could I do something good? I went to the fire camp program, which was actually a success. In 2002, they closed it because there was abuse of staff. And should I say, not fire captains, but some fire captains used to threaten youth. And the youth just didn't tolerate it, and they closed down the fire camp program. Our camp was Ben Lomond Camp, which was actually one of the successes, that there was no violence in that camp because of good staff that were normal people that treated kids normal. So that's why we didn't beat up the staff, because they were like family. And yeah, so I got kicked out of fire camp because, you know, just doing kid stuff while being a negative kid at that time. Went back to a regular institution, was Preston, and this was 2003. And yeah, that's when a good friend of mine, Feaster, committed suicide. He was from Stockton. He was a Crip. You know, there's a black and brown relation within our neighborhoods. So yeah, it was just a trip that he killed himself. I didn't understand until I actually went to Ironwood and tasted that lockup. It was like, man, it's so depressing, and all you could do is work out and, you know, get your mind off the stresses of life, you know. And yeah, I was surprised that he did that. I still talk to his brother, Chief. He's a good friend of mine. And yeah, so I tasted that institution, what it was like, you know. Preston. First time touching down was like, they give you your staff rules, your rewards handbook, and then you get your HHPs from the homies, which is your household policies. And if you're part of a subgroup, you got to follow rules on top of rules. So you can't eat, you can't talk with a certain race or eat with a certain race, or you're frowned upon by your own. And yeah, so then I went to Chet, which was like prison. Kids were all tatted up. I was the only one that wasn't tattooed because I guess my level of violence left me, like put me in that place, and not my tattoos or my marks. And yeah, I touched it there, and I was like, what's going on here? And seemed like the youth were running the program. And I was like, wow, I felt a little fearful at first, but the neighborhood I come from is very respected, and the people that I know are very respected. So that's what gave me a little gateway into my relations of social circle of gaining status. And yeah, I just seen there was something really wrong with that, with the problem. And it was just a lot of, it started with the riots with the Bulldogs, and then it went off into the staff abusing verbally. And then there was prison guys that came back from prison, and they didn't tolerate no verbal abuse. So there was physical altercations of hit squads that people that had jurisdiction of 10 years, 9 years, 8 years of YA, they signed up to go to prison. Say, yeah, we'll beat up a staff and we'll go to prison because prison, they treat us like human. You know, we get canteen, we get our visits, we're not in our cell 24/0. I get to use the phone to call my mom and see if she's alive, and stuff like that. So yeah, we're just on lockdown, and I was like, wow, what's going on here? And just a lot of, you know, verbal abuse, and they used to take us to shower with our 2 paintball launchers. They got riot gear. It's like, man, I'm just one person. I'm halfway naked. Like, you know what's going on here? But they showered us to shower like that with the guns pointed at us and talking smack and stuff. And just a lot of kids just started just physically engaging into the staff. Some staff were scared, so they just like told us, like, I'm not disrespecting, I don't want no problems with you guys, so if you guys could just not hurt me. And we're like, well, you're cool, you're normal, so we're not gonna do nothing to you. You're like, cool, you try to help us out. You give us word puzzles or a Jolly Rancher or something, you know, the little things that matters. But yeah, then one of my friends, I didn't believe it until I actually hit the streets, but he committed suicide, Joseph Maldonado. They called him Little Joe. He was from South Sacramento, from Franklin. He had a street, you know, he came from the similar like background I got of not having stable parents, should I say. Parents that love us, but are not stable as in economics and education and stuff. So, you know, we built a bond, and I saddled up with him because he was gonna beat up on somebody that was saying he was from his neighborhood, but he wasn't. And the homies were gonna slice his face. And I was like, wait a minute, don't slice his face. He's just a kid. He came from Preston where we fight against each other. I was like, just let me bunk it up with him so I can educate him on how to program. So when I bunked it up with them, I built a bond with them. And then once all the riots were going on with the staff, they separated us to single cells. So we won't communicate or be as organized, should I say. And yeah, that's when he just killed himself. And it was hard to believe, you know. Like, I didn't believe it the whole time I was there. All the homies were like, yeah, he's weak, he deserved to die. And it was just, everything was fake to me. It was like, I was emotionally numb, should I say. And yeah, I came out and got involved with Sammy. And yeah, he just took me to a meeting one day. I was still, you know, caught up in my own mentality. And to a Spino meeting, Madeira, Huron or somewhere. And there's a bunch of kids, you know, just talking about youth justice, educational equity, Schools to Jails pipeline. Didn't know what that was at that time. And I was like, so what are you guys doing here? And then, oh yeah, we're organizing a candlelight vigil for Joseph Maldonado. And I was like, Joseph who? Then yeah, it just hit me that they did something for my friend, and you know, the state or no one helped pay for his funeral. Just some kids did from the streets. And none of these kids came from like my background, so I felt a little like weird, but that just changed me. It made me cry, you know, and it changed me. And I just, you know, I dedicate my work to Joseph. You know, it's my boy. And yeah, I just see that there's a need for youth carrying on youth. You know, I think our adults don't care for us too much. I'm not blaming you guys, but in those systems, our adults don't care for us. It's only us. Youth take care of youth. When I didn't have hygiene, the youth helped me out, not the staff. When I didn't have food, the youth helped me out. Or, you know, when I didn't have family, no one has put money on my books. There'd always been another youth to help me out. So I just look at it as my time to give back and to help out other youth that are in the situation I was in. And yeah, I just learned a lot through, you know. And now I see the barriers of lack of after-school programs, lack of faith-based programs that are actually changing hearts, making people human again. And yeah, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. We need everyone's help. And yeah. So, yeah.
Thank you, Ruben. So Sammy, you know, makes you have to take a moment. Thank you. So Sammy, you start the Center for Fathers and Families. You have your own experience. Maybe you could share a little bit and then talk about, you know, the work you're doing and, you know, what's driving your passion and, you know, what's your vision for, you know, a better future for kids who get off track, but who deserve every opportunity to be, you know, the fullest persons they could be as well. So.
We have a saying in our agency, the future can heal the past. We need to recognize that dark past of the pain that has been imposed on our children, and really recognize that and come to terms with that. But I do believe that Ruben's children now won't have to experience that, you see, because he's found healing, and when a person in the family heals, the rest of the family heals, and so Ruben's children will never have to experience that because he has a community that surrounds him, that loves him. You know, we hold each other accountable. When you care about somebody, you make certain that they don't go into a path that's going to lead to some hurt, pain. And so I'm honored to organize with Ruben as he was in there. I knew at least one of them could hear us. Those walls weren't tall enough. Those fences weren't sharp enough to keep our intention and our prayers for them from reaching them. I think that's really important. Just even I spend a lot of time praying for a lot of the kids that I've had the honor of working with, and we pray for them so they don't get preyed upon, like Ruben here as a child. I want to thank you for having this convening for. Really, Dan, I feel as though you've chronicled and captured what we've known in the neighborhood for over 20 years. And it brought it to light. And there's something about the written word that's very important. Something about capturing that and telling the truth that is very, very important in this time that we're faced with right now. Where we're making decisions that are going to last the next 7 generations, where our children's children's children are going to be impacted by this. And of course, Chet, thank you for taking on such a controversial issue. I ask you, what's so controversial about saving kids' lives? Isn't that the craziness that we're dealing with right now, that we call this a controversial issue? And I ask you, what is controversial about saving kids' lives? I see no higher calling, no more of a defined and positive purpose than standing in the gap with the most vulnerable children in our society and holding that space with them and loving them till they love themselves, trusting them till they trust themselves, and advocating for them until they advocate for themselves and others. That is the work that we're doing ultimately. And I want to thank you all, because for the last 15 years I've been waiting for this opportunity to just talk about this on a larger scale, because we've known this. As a young man myself, I was on that pathway, of course. I think many of us in this room maybe at some point can say, I made some mistakes. But was I the mistake? Was I a mistake? And a lot of our children contemplate that. As they voyage from childhood to adolescence and into adulthood, they need guides and people to help them navigate. And of course they're going to make mistakes. That's the whole purpose of adolescence, which I feel is the whole purpose of a juvenile justice department, recognizing that the voyage to adolescence is wrought with a lot of different traps and mistakes and issues and blessings and burdens and all these things. And they need guides. They need people to help them navigate that. As a young man who also migrated, and again, I hear my story reflected in so many of our young people. The beautiful part about it is that even though the system hasn't changed much since the 18th century, I thought you were talking about now. I had to look over a little bit of my sister and say, when is he talking about the 18th century or today? Because it sounds like contemporary society sometimes, because we also understand we still have a long way to go. There has been a lot of changes, and I think a lot of the changes, I want to acknowledge all the folks that have been organizing, and grassroots organizers that have fought this fight for so long, and now the rest of our society is kind of coming to terms with this, and it is now coming to fruition. Our work was not in vain when we stood with those young people. And that's a beautiful thing to actually see that the rest of y'all caught up. But so as a young man and migrating, and we all know that every migration is about freedom. Every migration. When your grandparent migrated, when my people migrated, our people migrated, they were migrating towards something of freedom from violence, freedom from oppression, freedom from tyranny. And we ended up here in South Sacramento or South Stockton or any side of town where the data tells the story. We have proof that these children, based on race and place and a zip code, we can determine who's going to end up in a juvenile justice facility, or worse yet. Yet our interventions and our approaches hasn't really caught up. And it's kind of interesting to me. Is that a mistake, or is that by design? I question these things sometimes. Because certainly I feel as though when I was in that process and as a young man, I recall, if I may, go off script here. No script. I never have a script. I just free flow. And I do apologize if I offend anybody. That is genuinely not my purpose. I do it out of ignorance, not out of intent. But as an 18-year-old, just fathered a child. My daughter was born January 3rd, 1993. February 13th, I was shot in a drive-by shooting by another angry young man who had a 12-gauge shotgun and a chip on his shoulder and a point to prove. And he almost killed me. I actually flatlined 4 times. He left me permanently with a variety of different kinds of issues, right, including severed the nerves to my arm, punctured my lung, shattered my collarbone, not to mention the psychosocial, the psychological, emotional, spiritual impact that it left me with. And I remember sitting there and waking up from this just stupor after being almost murdered in my own neighborhood, in my own block. And I remember thinking to myself, what is my purpose here? Why did I even survive? They don't call it suicide, certainly, when you step in front of a 12-gauge shotgun, but what else would you call it? I don't know. I just felt as though we were dispensable. And and seeing my mother and her prayers and her cries, and she was there the whole time, wouldn't leave my side. And then soon thereafter, there was 2 groups of people that came into my room. One was law enforcement, and they came in. Let's just say we had kind of a love-hate relationship, sometimes without the love. I mean, no, and they came in, and there were the G-Force. That was when the gang task force, they came in and pretty much said, you're guilty. You're guilty for where you're at. You're guilty for what's happening. You're guilty for everything in your life. And I'm sitting there with machines all over, startled, terrified, not knowing what's going to happen. Why did I live? Why shouldn't I die? And my mother praying for me, and they're there in front of my mother and talking to me in this way. And I thought, that is not right. You're making my mother, she's going to have a breakdown right now. I don't even know who you are. How do you know me, that I deserve to die, or that I brought this upon myself? And I was immediately kind of, just like my whole physiological, it had an immediate physiological impact on me. And of course, my mom kind of ushered them out, and then right after that, a group of my friends came in, and their philosophy was a little bit different, and they said, we gotta go do something about this, we gotta, we have to do, and we have to do it, and that's just that, and in their eyes, an act of solidarity with me, and I was just so confused in that moment where I'm just like barely coming back to consciousness, contemplating all these different things. And I was in the hospital rehabbing for some time, got out of the hospital, and was met with by some of my friends, and we did that. There's ad hoc, de facto policies in our communities that have, fortunately, at times sets up our kids for failure. There's not a variety of options. So when we say, I think that there's a lot of things we need to check in our society, not just a system as it is, but our system in our communities that sets up our young people sometimes, that doesn't give them much options to work with, and they have to live in those communities. And sometimes these are their very relatives, right? And it's just this really intense situation. And I did, and I retaliated. I was 18 years old. My daughter was a few months old by this point, because she was only a month old, not even a month old when I got shot. I was in the hospital for a few months, and I got out, and I retaliated. And I was faced with a choice. They said, you can either go to California Youth Authority, or you can go to prison. Now, I said, send me to prison right off the bat, because I want to see my family. See, because we knew CYA was known back then as gladiator school. We all knew that in the neighborhood. You knew if you went to YA, you will not parole on your date. Everyone knew that. Everyone knew that. Everyone knew that if you go into CYA with a year sentence, you were lucky if you get out of there within 6 years.
Yep.
And not only that, when you come back, even if you're not violent, you better be violent enough to protect yourself, and you will come out violent, and you will come out traumatized, and we know this. So I said, no, I'm good, peace, I'm good, send me to prison. So at 18 years old, I found myself going to prison versus CYA. I will acknowledge my friend Tony, who's still he chose the alternate route, and he went to YA. And he's never came home since, frankly. And I just shudder at the idea that I could have made the wrong choice at that moment without a lot of guidance, just knowing what I knew in my instinct and my gut, and decided something different. Fast forward now to what we're seeing and some of the atrocities that our communities have faced. Our communities have been under siege for 30 plus years. We know that. They've been under siege for so long. It's not even a miracle that it's kind of a miracle that the kids show up still. They're learning to trust us again. What's more of a miracle, they show up happy to be there. That's a beautiful thing that we are happy to do this work, and the work is the same. I think that at this point right now we have has been said, a window of opportunity to shape and design and be the architects of the next generation or two of what's going to happen with juvenile justice reform. And I'm hoping that we can make some better decisions. Seems to me like the behaviors didn't come before the policies, but the policies and the outcomes the policies came out, and some of the children's outcomes as a result, we've seen the impact it's had versus, and we know that some of these policies have been born out of disparate treatment, neglect out of the most vulnerable in our community. We know that, so we shouldn't be surprised with the outcome. But now we're in the process of actually working with the most impacted. I will say that in our local county, I want to give props where props are needed, where they're deserving. And our local police, our probation chief, has done a really good job and is trying to really, really change that system. And she sits with our young people and listens to them and makes decisions based on what their involvement in it. Now, we have a long way to go. Give me some props, but just showing up is the first. I had never had a probation chief to show up with our young people. This is the first time that we've ever had a probation chief be present.
Sammy, I want you to say a little bit about the center, your philosophy, and then I want you to take the same question I posed to Dan. Given your experience, your knowledge, your passion, what are the three things in this period that we really need to work hard to ensure that we get right?
It's about 4 questions right there.
So
You're my kind of guy. That's the way we roll, huh?
Try to give me 3 answers. Right?
So first of all, many of us are like, any of you have parents, are parents of children that's 17 years old right now, or 16, 17? I am. And right now, talking about graduation and prom and pictures and all these different things, and what are you going to do after that, right? You're going to go to Delta College, where are you going to go? And but unfortunately, a lot of our children don't have that. They don't have those kinds of conversations. So first and foremost, those are the kinds of conversations you'll see in our center are every single day of the week. And so I think that working with the most impacted by these systems is the most important work that we do, and actually amplifying their voice is the most important work. I think that, frankly, when we know that children are faced with some tremendous obstacles, and again, they don't have, I feel at some point they don't even many times have adults that they can trust to intervene in their problems and give them, I feel as though that's what our job is to hold that space with them and their parents for that matter. The other thing is in our center is that our youngest organizer is 12. Our eldest is like 97. So we have a culture of organizing and healing, but we believe everything begins with healing. We believe that given the context, the historical context of what's happened, many of our folks didn't create that, weren't involved in the design, weren't involved in the policies that shaped it, weren't even involved in understanding why these things were happening in our community. We just witnessed it after the fact, after these intellectuals and academics created these scientific, whatever, and then it kind of comes in and trickles down into the community. So now what we have to do is actually, to some degrees, change that dynamic and have the most impacted people in the conversations at the table. As it's been said, if you're not at the table, then you're on the menu, and I think that we've been on the menu far too long, and now it's time to actually be at the table and start to change the narrative and broaden the conversation to include what our experiences have been, but more importantly, what our ambitions are for our community. Look no further than our young people here today to see the measurement, the metrics of how far love can go. How do we measure love? Were they thinking about how do you love a child? I mean, sometimes that's the most important thing you do when you have children in your life is love them through these processes, love them through these challenges, love them through these struggles. And I think that, by and large, that's what's happening in our centers, that we're actually not only organizing and healing and all that work. You have our youth programs, we have our elders program, and we just now are launching our trauma recovery center because we know that the most traumatized children in our society have very little access to therapists, and actually have more access to probation officers than therapists. And I think right now that's what we're trying to do is change that narrative and make sure that our kids that have the most chronic trauma in their life, it's not post-trauma, it's chronic trauma, chronic, perpetual, unmitigated trauma in their life, that they have access to intensive clinical services, treatment services, and people that actually love them and actually are willing to go the distance with them. I remember talking to some young people when they said, "Man, dude, it sounds like you really believe in this, bruh." And I said, "I believe in it with all my heart, with all my might. I believe in it." He goes, "How far are you willing to go? Are you willing to go as far as I am?" Every single day, baby boy. Like, that is the conversations that we're having with these young people. They want to know, are we really sincere? Are we really genuine about this work? I laugh about this because, now we have this beautiful sprawling center. We're expanding into a new center. We have the Stockton Trauma Recovery Center, one of 6 in the state. We're recognized for all of our work. But, when we started with this work, Matt came and saw me in a warehouse Unemployed. Well, unemployed. He said, you were volunteering. I go, nah, man, I was investing, man. So I think that our investment has brought a really good return on our investment. And at this point right now, we believe, Chet, that, first of all, we're in this for the long haul. We're going to continue to show up in these spaces for sure, when we're invited or not. And I think, I think that's happened. That needs to happen too sometimes, to show up in these spaces. And that takes an incredible amount of courage. And I think the other thing is that we believe that what we put our mind to do, we in our community, our partners in our community, that has long suffered some of the neglect and mistreatment and maltreatment, of our community, are now at a point where we put our intentions to, what we put our minds to. This, what we're doing right now, is what Stockton will become. This work will actually start to take hold, and actually I think we're going to see our best days in front of us, both in policy, because we're crafting policies now. Mm-hmm. We're crafting policies now. I mean, that's major, to be able to craft policies, not just be the recipients and like, well, how are we going to swing this one? I don't know. Right? But also, organizing the community, doing all that work that is necessary, but not in a transactional way, but more in a transformative way, having some, like, really being forward-thinking in our approach to this, to shape, again, the future of our region, to shape the future of California. And as we know, as California goes, so does the nation. As the nation goes, so does the world. So I think that we are advancing and hoping to accelerate the good work that is captured and chronicled in this important text, and we're actually hoping that we can actually leverage this to realize the future of juvenile justice reform.
Two things. I want to let's thank everyone. Really want to thank Ruben for sharing his story, and Dan for the extraordinary work in the book. And it's a thick book, but you really should read it. You see all my notes. I have things you have to do. And of course, Sammy, for sharing a vision for the future and inspiring us passionately to understand that there is more work to be done. Yeah. We need to celebrate the success, and this is what I take from your statements, but to be very clear that there is a lot more work that needs to be done. I know that Matt is going to, we have some questions. We said we were going to get to a point where we were going to let folks ask. Just give me a moment. Okay. I know we're going to have some questions that even come from Merced, so Matt's prepared to do that. So if you give me your last brief statement, we'll start taking.
Yeah, I just wanted to answer the third question that you had here in terms of the future of this. Mm-hmm. Number one, we believe, and again, I apologize if I offend, but I have to speak what I've been mandated by my young people to speak. We want to end the treatment of youth, of children as adults. We want to reduce the probation terms to 12 months maximum. We want to eliminate fees that are charged to families for youth that are detained. And we want to invest in detention alternatives. Those are basically the comments that are coming from the ground of our young folks.
Policy agenda. We'll turn it back over to Matt. And Matt, questions?
Thanks, Chet. So we are going to take questions now. The first one will be coming from Merced. And this goes to whoever would like to respond from the panel, but particularly Dan. Can you speak about the intersection of mass incarceration, detention of immigrant children currently? Immigrant detention centers are privately run by big companies, and children get placed with adults. Any comments, any reflections?
I mean, it's an ongoing problem. It's the institutionalization of kids, and in this case, it's for profit. And it's because they're a private company. In fact, the biggest provider, if we want to use that term again, needed, of incarceration services for immigrants is the CCA, Corrections Corporation of America, which is a private prison company. Mm-hmm. So I'll turn it over to you guys. Yeah.
When I heard that Bob Barker is invested in prison industries, it kind of blew me. Yeah. You guys know who Bob Barker is, right? Come on down, let's make a deal. Yep. He's investing in prison in prison industries. When you think about everything you can think about that is made, manufactured in society right now is being made in prisons. When you think about the greatest amendments not protecting those people in prisons, it's kind of a reminder of the dark past that we have, to be honest with you. And we start seeing the newest kinds of folks that are being impacted by this. First it was the Irish, and now it's the new immigrants right now. It's kind of the same story. It rings true today than it did yesterday. I would hope that somewhere down the line, somebody looking back doesn't think of us as so like, can you believe in 2016 they were still doing this? Right? Because that's exactly what they're going to be saying unless we change our course on immigration and criminalizing the most vulnerable in our community.
Yep.
A reoccurring theme.
Yes, a recurring theme. Yes, sir.
Who has a question from the audience? I have another one from Merced, but yes, Shirley. Hang on, we have a microphone coming, so Merced can hear you.
Shirley Darling with Muslim American Society Social Services Foundation. I was wondering if you would comment on whether in all of the diversity we have with all the cultures, if you see a lot of isolation and fracturing, or if they're working together, like in your organizations. Do you have a lot of representation of different faiths, different ethnicities, that kind of thing?
Absolutely. First of all, assalamu alaikum. Actually, I think it's real important to recognize that we create an integrated strategy. I think if you look in our agency, you're going to see a reflection of the community. I think that in all of its ways in society, we are taught to be divided, and I think that has, for us, the only way we could have survived is by counting on each other, and that rings true now in our center. Is like we have an intergenerational, multicultural movement. So you'll have everyone has a place there, for sure, in our agency, and you'll see that when you walk in. And I think that harmony is there. I think that we kind of believe the lies, right? Sometimes I feel as though, and the fact is that we have created a fear-based reality about those other people. And I feel like those other people are my people. What are you talking about, right? So I feel as though that's definitely prevalent in our agency. We have, again, just about every single, I don't know if we have every single demographic in our city, but certainly have definitely reflected those values. We're a racial justice organization. So we actually work, at making certain that we honor that.
Can I actually just add to that? It's actually an argument why we need to move services to the local level, because this is positive. This is getting people together. You take a group of us and throw us into a California Youth Authority institution. We're all going to subdivide, and we're going to divide by race and ethnicity and where we came from. And and it's
Story.
And that's what happens in institutions. And then kids fight with each other. It's not a good, not good lessons.
Yeah.
Yes, please wait for the microphone. Madeline's going to hand it to you.
Hi, Ana Andrade with the California Adolescent Health Collaborative. And just to follow up on what you said, so what do you suggest we do to change these institutionalized models?
Well, first of all, actually going back, I would get rid of the state system. I mean, we're down to 700 kids. We've got, and there are only about 500 of them are juvenile court commitments, because we still have the adult population there too. So it's a small number of kids. We have right now at the county level about between 5,000 and 6,000 spare institutional beds at the county level. For example, we got a call. The other day we got a call from a public defender in Stanislaus County. Stanislaus County is a population of, it's a county with I think 550,000, and they've got a 120-bed juvenile hall and a 60-bed, brand new, post-disposition facility, and they've got 10 kids in it. And not that I want more kids in it, but they're also, so now they're back sending kids to the California Youth Authority. This is the public defender was telling us they hadn't seen cases like this being recommended to the California Youth Authority, or the Division of Juvenile Justice now. I get caught in old patterns. But they haven't seen cases like this in 2 to 3 years. But now they're getting a flood of them because the word's gone out that the state institutional system's been fixed. It's all great again. And so starts, and the state the DJJ sends out their emissaries to juvenile courts across the state telling them that, hey, we can take them. And so, so it's kind of repeated this pattern. So the first thing I would do is, we don't need to send kids to state institutions. We can keep them local. And I'm not saying I get a lot of people angry at me because, well, the county institutions, you'll hear a lot of, they can't handle them, they're not great, and some of that is true, but we'll never fix it as long as we've got the state system.
May I just add to that? Is that okay?
Yeah,
First of all,
please.
acknowledge there's a problem.
Yeah.
That would help. When there's problems, acknowledge it.
Yeah.
And commit to changing behaviors.
Yeah.
Right? That's what we want for our kids, right? That's what we expect from them. Acknowledge there's a problem when there is, and commit to changing behaviors. And I'll tell you one of the things that has been proven to be very successful, as you know, Anna. I don't want to, bust you out, but I have a, organizing background, and actually, Anna formerly was working with the department there, and we've worked with the probation department. And I think that there's something really important, and I wouldn't even say it's magical, but there's all of a sudden things work, right? When you have folks from the community inside those institutions and actually having a reentry program with folks that you already know, that you have a relationship with, and we have that pipeline right now, and it's proven to be very effective at reducing recidivism, exponentially in our county. I think to the degree that we can actually have community, it's almost as though there's like a community within a community sometimes, and they should still be considered. That's our community. They're still our community kids. Yeah. There should be no mistaking that these are our kids in that system. That's right. And that we will be there when they're in there, and we will be there to pick them up, and we will be there to make certain that they get to school, right? I mean, so I think that actually really creating this integrated strategy and really involving community is very important. I think any top-down approach has proven time and time again to be ineffective. Efficacy can be found in the bottom-up approach, where community is involved in every single decision of a system, in the systems kind of process. So I think it's really important to recognize that.
Yeah.
Well, let me be provocative a little bit around this, and not that I don't disagree with what's been said, but let me ask about the challenges of getting local jurisdictions to do the right thing as well. Now, we live in a period where you have tremendous reform. We call it realignment in California. I'm old enough to call it devolution, right? We push everything back down to the counties all over again. Yep. You had major legislation which created these safety councils in communities, public safety councils, where folks, sheriffs and probation office chiefs and folks got together to develop new plans for dealing with reentry and other things that are challenging around the system as well. We've been supportive as a foundation of juvenile justice reform at the local level. It has not been easy.
Right. That's right.
To get localities to learn from these lessons and lean forward in terms of thinking about new approaches, including engaging with community and young people in meaningful ways that give us the best chance for setting up, new systems. So while I totally agree with the notion of, not having the fail-safe that everybody runs to in terms of a state system for the kids who are challenging for whatever number of reasons, and I totally agree that bottoms approaches can be very effective and people need to be engaged in those systems. I'd like to hear a little bit more about, what some of the challenges have been and things that you've seen. You've done work in San Joaquin, and that's really kind of constraining the level of reform that I think is doable. I say this a lot to folks. When the Koch brothers and Van Jones agree that something needs to change, if you know those two individuals, or groups of individuals, that criminal justice reform should be at the center of the kind of public policy debate in this country, and that dismantling those systems is something that we should be focused on. It suggests that there is a politically cleared path, regardless of your kind of political bent, to do some extraordinary things without being called soft on crime or dumb or whatever it happens to be. What's holding us back?
Should I go first, or you? I'll take the first stab at it. First of all, when Chet was head of Department of Social Services in Alameda County, he did amazing stuff. Unfortunately, most counties don't have Chet Hewitts at the head of, and it's true. And you have we've got 58 counties, and this is really the challenge for juvenile justice reform in the future, because There's nothing harder than changing old bureaucracies. I mean, really, that is the lesson that we're talking about. I think that I'm writing about here. Once these systems get established, they've got constituents, and they've got certain ways of thinking, routines, patterns, policy. Not that they're bad, they're good people, but people get locked in their ways, and you get caught in your box. And it's hard to think outside that box. And so we get permanent, and we get permanently trapped in that box. And it's hard to break out of it. And you know, it's going to have to be a multi-tiered strategy as we move into the 21st century. And I think, you know, the stuff that Sammy's talking about is golden. You've got to have, some counties, some places may have leaders that are going to take charge and they're going to be committed to it and they're going to want to make it happen, but they're rare. And a lot of times change doesn't happen unless somebody's forced to do it. And it's going to differ with each jurisdiction. And I think what's going to happen in the future for strategy, and foundation people in the room here, you're going to have to look at multiple strategies, top down and bottom up. And the bottom up, I mean grassroots advocacy that pushes these old bureaucracies to do things in a different way, that think outside the box, that creates the political pressure to bring change. It's not a neat policy. It's not like you studied in public policy school in college, where you have inputs in the box and then outputs. It doesn't work that. It's a political thing. It's the art of public policy, and it's going to differ with each jurisdiction and the personalities involved, and so it's not going to be easy, and there's no easy answer.
Well, I think, and Sammy laid out this notion of the demand side. I mean, getting communities organized to demand change.
Yes.
And engagement. I mean,
Yes.
letting them be a source of ideas and contribution to that. But what you're talking about is this need to invest in leadership.
Yeah, yeah.
That that you need a kind of an inside-outside strategy. And I say because you referenced your work with Chief in San Joaquin,
Yes.
you gave a shout out to being a very important part of that particular strategy.
Well, yeah, you need bold leadership at that level that is willing to take some risk and put some skin in the game, but also you got to recognize that there is rank and file there, that there's a history of doing things a certain way. Even if, as we're going, I'm sitting on the Reducing Racial and Ethnic Disparities Executive Steering Committee, sat on that with actually, I think Anna was there in some of the learning environments, and we kind of stirred the pot a little bit in there and really challenged the thinking in there, and there was pushback, and that's all part of our unfolding a new strategy. And I think that it's not only about bold, but you see the chief of probations or system leaders have to report to a board of supervisors. The board of supervisors voted by the general public. I think one of the things that we owe to ourselves is, as we start decriminalizing our communities and uncaging our communities, is making certain that we're participating in democracy, democratizing this in our local communities, right? I ran for office. Why? I ran again in and I live in it's a pretty conservative, I guess safe to say it's pretty conservative in our county. And the first question that was asked to me was, you can't even vote, let alone run for office. You have a record. And I said, what record are we talking about here? A record of service in this community, or a record 20 years ago? I said, but make no mistake about it, not only can I run, not only can I vote, I have been voting. I've been vetted by the registrar's office, but more importantly, I could win, and that's why you're here. I think number one, getting folks that are now being reclassified as felons and being able to vote, making certain that they are participating fully. Because I would believe, I don't even know if there's a data. I'm just going to put it out there and be provocative myself and say that people that participate in democracy, participate in civically, are less likely to commit crime. Is it safe to say that? So the more people that are activated. So we had our first ever formerly incarcerated candidate forum some time ago as well, to bring folks that were, and you had the district attorney in there, you had the person running for sheriff, the first ever, and it was a standing room only house. So knowing that there is a voting, that's how you're going to have to shift the power dynamics and how decisions are made. If there is no pressure coming from the ground, our job is to give ground cover. When you're doing the right thing, yes, this is everything we stand against, but let me tell you, this is what we stand for, and when you stand for that as well, we're going to stand with you, and we're going to give you ground cover. We're going to actually show up in the Board of Supervisors. We're going to show up in City Council. We're going to show up despite even when they don't want to hear it. We have to continue to show up in those spaces. And then also, we also have an individual responsibility at a community level as well. But ultimately, we also got to think long-term. We have to have an end game kind of long-term strategy to make certain that folks in positions of power that are making decisions are actually really either grounded or making decisions based on all of their constituencies. Not and so that's very important that we continue to do that.
Throw it back to Matt. You have any questions or?
Well, yes, we have another question from Merced. So, and this will be the last one. I'm sorry for those in the room. So, in the history of youth corrections, are there stories of youth after being incarcerated for 25 years, being released, and attaining connections to jobs, recidivism, reducing recidivism, et cetera? Any thoughts, reactions to?
Like you mean kids that were incarcerated for 25 years straight?
Or just
YA?
in youth
I actually
corrections?
got one of my best friends. He was tried as a minor, as an adult in Samuel County. He got 15 years. He went to the youth authority system. He got out. He got his degree. Actually, Philip Carranza. My boy Philip Carranza, wherever you at. He's out there in the world. But yeah, he just my boy just stays home, man. He's a 2-strike felon. He goes to work, he goes home, and really a lot of his social relations, like going to the park and socializing like that, he don't do that no more. He like more or less in a family setting where he's safe, secure. But yeah, his story is just telling everybody, just sign up for school. I did it. I didn't have no GED or nothing. The system didn't teach me nothing besides how to commit crime. And I still came out and I got my degree, And he's pushing me to go to school right now. He's like, go to school, bro. And, but yeah, it's people like that are success stories to tell the other youth that are fresh out or are still locked up that there is a chance for you out here. Even though you come out 30 years old or 25 years old, you still got, a lot of time left, because some of them think like, oh man, I'm just going to do life. And they give up, on their life because they're already at a certain age. But yeah, just telling them that it's never too late. There's people go to school at 50 years old, 60 years old.
I think it's important to recognize just my brother here, Ruben, who actually has never been in an adult facility. He's never been incarcerated as an adult. Went in at I think he was 17, 16 when he went in. Even younger than that when he first stepped into a juvenile facility. He was in YA when he was 16 or 17 and has never, ever looked back, has never, and so there's a lot of stories like that, but the sad truth is that we know the data tells a story. That should be a centerpiece of any kind of informing these public officials about what's working. San Joaquin County has the lowest rates it's ever had in the detention center and actually has the lowest rates of youth violence it's ever had. So go figure, right? There's something happens when you partner up these institutions with community groups that are actually going the distance, like our sister agency over here, Mary Magdalene, also works with the same young folks in the community. I think it's really important to have those kinds of partnerships. So we have all kinds of testimonies of folks that have come out of the DOJ or CYA and are actually doing A-OK.
Any closing words, Chet, or?
You take it away.
Okay. Well, just an expression of appreciation for our panelists, for Dan. Yeah.